Addiction is often misunderstood as a simple lapse in discipline or willpower, a behavior that one could overcome if they truly desired to. But this surface-level judgment fails to grasp the depth of the human experience involved. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, challenged this shallow view. He saw addiction not as a moral weakness, but as a deep psychological and spiritual crisis. Beneath every addiction lies a silent, often unconscious quest for meaning, a spiritual longing that has been misdirected. The addict, in Jung's view, is not depraved, but disconnected, cut off from their inner center, from the vital source that gives their life coherence. Jung believed that addiction stems from a fractured sense of self, an existential void. The substances or compulsive behaviors people cling to are not the root problems, they are the misguided remedies. These behaviors provide fleeting relief from an internal ache that is hard to articulate, an ache often rooted in alienation, spiritual emptiness, or unresolved trauma. In this sense, addiction functions as a symbolic act, a search for sacredness, albeit in the wrong place. Jung is famously paraphrased as saying, "No addict heals unless they have a spiritual experience." The implication is clear. True recovery demands more than abstinence, it requires inner transformation. Many addicts do not fully understand what they are seeking. They feel a persistent unease, a sense that something crucial is missing. The behaviors that define their addiction, drinking, using drugs, excessive screen time, temporarily mask this emptiness, but never resolve it. Each episode of relief is followed by deeper dissatisfaction. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. The more the individual tries to fill the void externally, the more they lose contact with the real inner source of suffering, pushing healing further out of reach. Historically, many cultures recognized the spiritual potential of altered states. Psychoactive substances were used in sacred rituals, not for escape, but to connect with deeper truths. Today, however, these same substances are consumed in a vacuum stripped of context, meaning, and reverence. The result is fragmentation, not expansion. Without a symbolic structure to hold their experience, individuals are left adrift, chasing transcendence in ways that only deepen their disconnection. For Jung, addiction was a spiritual hunger, a cry from the soul. Symbols, myths, and meaningful images are the food of the psyche. When these are lost, the soul deteriorates. Addiction then becomes a desperate substitute for what the psyche truly craves: connection, integration, wholeness. Understanding this changes everything. It reframes addiction not as a failure, but as a misguided attempt to heal a deep inner wound. To understand addiction, as Carl Jung did, is to view it as more than a compulsion. It is a symptom of a much deeper struggle. Jung saw it as a spiritual problem, a kind of sickness of the soul. The addicted person is not merely indulging in harmful behavior. They are seeking something vital, though they often don't know what it is. Their substance of choice, whether alcohol, drugs, gambling, or even work, is not what they truly crave. What they long for is meaning, wholeness, and reconnection with their lost center. The external dependency is only a stand-in for the internal absence. The relief provided by addiction is deceptive. It offers momentary peace, a temporary numbing of the deeper pain, but it never addresses the real issue. This is why the satisfaction fades so quickly and why the urge to use returns even stronger. The addict is not weak-willed, they are desperate. They are trying to fill a void that cannot be satisfied with anything external. Jung believed this repeated pattern signaled something powerful, that the soul is crying out for integration, for authenticity, for connection with something larger than the self. In modern society, where symbolic meaning has been stripped away from daily life, the individual is often left spiritually orphaned. We no longer have shared myths or sacred rituals to help us navigate suffering. As a result, people unconsciously turn to substances or behaviors to simulate what those rituals once provided: a sense of transcendence, connection, and sacred belonging. But without symbolic grounding, this attempt becomes a fall into chaos, not a rise into meaning. The substance becomes a false god, promising healing but delivering further fragmentation. Jung's influence on the early recovery movement, especially in Alcoholics Anonymous, was rooted in this understanding. When Bill Wilson read Jung's letter stating that only a spiritual experience could cure addiction, it reshaped the foundation of recovery. Programs like AA were not built around punishment or moral shame, but around spiritual transformation. The addict wasn't told merely to stop, but to surrender, to allow something deeper to emerge from within. Recovery became less about control and more about awakening. Addiction, in this light, is not a character flaw but a spiritual signal. It tells us that the soul is starving for meaning, that something essential has been forgotten or broken. The challenge is not just to remove the substance, but to rediscover the sacred purpose it was trying to replace. In this way, addiction is both a wound and an invitation to look inward and begin the journey back to the self. Carl Jung introduced the concept of the shadow as the hidden part of the psyche, the aspects of ourselves we repress, deny, or disown. When it comes to addiction, the shadow plays a central role. The addictive impulse often stems from inner conflicts that the conscious mind refuses to face. This includes unresolved trauma, buried emotions, and disowned desires. Over time, what we suppress doesn't vanish. It simply retreats into the unconscious, where it festers and eventually erupts in compulsive behaviors. Addiction, then, becomes an unconscious strategy to avoid confronting the pain stored in the shadow. For Jung, the addict is not battling the substance, but a part of themselves. This internal war is between the persists, socially acceptable mask we wear, and the shadow, which carries everything we've rejected in order to conform. When the shadow remains unintegrated, it demands attention in destructive ways. The substance provides temporary relief from this tension, but it does not resolve the inner division. Instead, it deepens it. Every time the addict uses, they reinforce the split between who they are and who they pretend to be. This dynamic can be incredibly deceptive. The addict often believes their problem is external, the alcohol, the environment, the stress, but the true source lies within. Addiction becomes a symptom of a deeper truth trying to emerge. The more a person avoids the inner conflict, the louder the shadow becomes. It hijacks their choices, drives their compulsions, and colors their perception of reality. The enemy isn't out there, it's the rejected part of themselves that's crying out to be seen. The process of healing, then, begins not with abstinence alone, but with radical self-honesty. Integrating the shadow means turning inward and facing what has been long denied, the shame, the grief, the rage. This isn't about blaming oneself, but about reclaiming lost pieces of the psyche. When a person begins to understand what their addiction was trying to protect them from, they can start to move toward wholeness. Jung insisted that this journey required courage, not condemnation. It is not about fixing a broken person, but about listening to what their suffering has to say. Addiction ceases to be a moral issue when seen in this light. It becomes a symbol, a dark whisper from the depths of the unconscious. By confronting the shadow, the addict transforms their suffering into understanding. They shift from being controlled by their pain to learning from it. This inner reconciliation is the true beginning of recovery, where addiction is no longer just a chain, but a key to deeper freedom. Behind every addiction lies a deeper, often invisible, emotional wound. While substances or behaviors may seem like the issue, they are often only symptoms of a more profound psychological and spiritual crisis. Many addicts, even after quitting their habit, continue to feel lost, empty, or irritable. This is because the real root of their suffering hasn't been addressed. It's not the drug or drink that's the core issue, it's what the drug helped them not feel. It is the unspoken pain that the addiction was masking all along. Often, this pain is rooted in past experiences that were never fully processed: abuse, neglect, abandonment, or humiliation. These emotional injuries lodge themselves deep in the unconscious, where they quietly shape behavior. Jung recognized that these experiences are stored in the shadow. The more painful they are, the more fiercely they are buried. But what is repressed doesn't die. It resurfaces in other forms: addictions, compulsions, and emotional numbness. These behaviors become the psyche's misguided way of crying out for help. The tragedy is that the addict often doesn't understand what they're avoiding. There's just a persistent ache, a sense of something missing. They may believe that if they could just stop the behavior, everything would be fine. But without addressing the emotional foundation beneath it, the void remains. The addiction may shift from one form to another: alcohol to work, drugs to food, gambling to social media, but the pattern continues. Healing requires more than quitting the substance. It requires facing what the substance helped suppress. This is why recovery is not simply a matter of discipline or willpower. It is an act of deep inner work. To confront the pain beneath the addiction means to acknowledge the truths one has long avoided. It demands self-compassion as much as it demands courage. The person must grieve what was lost, accept what was denied, and allow themselves to feel what has long been anesthetized. Jung emphasized that this was not a purely psychological act, but a spiritual one, a form of reconciliation with the self. Addiction, in this sense, is not a behavior to be punished, but a signal to be interpreted. It's a message from the soul saying, "There's something here you haven't faced." When the individual turns inward and meets their pain with honesty and gentleness, transformation becomes possible. The cycle can break not through force, but through understanding. What once felt like an endless pattern becomes a map, and the pain that once controlled them becomes a guide. Addiction is not simply a matter of choice or compulsion. It is often the expression of a hidden conflict within the self. Carl Jung described the shadow as the unconscious part of the personality that contains everything we've repressed: shame, rage, fear, longing. These are the parts we hide not only from others but also from ourselves. And yet, what is hidden still acts. It moves silently beneath the surface of our consciousness, shaping our behavior and responses without our awareness. In this way, addiction can be understood as the voice of the shadow crying out to be acknowledged. The addict, far from being morally defective, is often someone torn between opposing inner forces. One part seeks control, acceptance, and stability. The other is chaotic, emotional, and wounded, holding the memories and needs that were never allowed expression. Rather than face this inner conflict directly, the individual finds a shortcut. The addictive behavior offers a temporary sense of relief. It soothes the pain without resolving it. But the shadow does not rest. What is repressed returns. It returns as symptoms, compulsions, or crises that demand attention. This inner battle becomes especially destructive when the addict mistakes their enemy for the substance itself, rather than the pain that drives the craving. They may spend years trying to quit without ever understanding why they are drawn to the behavior in the first place. Jung taught that until the shadow is brought into the light of awareness, it will continue to rule the person's life from behind the scenes. The true task is not suppression, but integration, the conscious acceptance of all parts of the self, especially the painful and rejected ones. To integrate the shadow is not easy. It is not about indulging every impulse, nor is it about endless self-blame. It is about seeing clearly. The person must begin to ask, what am I really avoiding? What have I never allowed myself to feel? What does my addiction represent at a symbolic level? These are not intellectual questions, but deeply emotional ones. The answers are often revealed slowly, through dreams, memories, therapy, or moments of deep reflection. And they require honesty, willingness to see what one has spent years denying. When the shadow is faced, it no longer has to sabotage. The addict begins to feel less split, less at war with themselves. The energy once used to hide or numb the truth becomes available for healing and creativity. The compulsion loses its grip because the deeper need is finally being met, the need to be whole. Jung believed that within the shadow lies not only darkness, but gold. Hidden in what we fear or avoid is the key to our transformation. When the addict meets their shadow with courage, they step into their own power, not the power of control, but the power of authenticity. The journey of healing from addiction, in Jungian terms, is not about returning to some imagined former purity. It is about becoming whole. Carl Jung saw the addict not as someone who must be corrected or punished, but as someone on a misdirected quest for transcendence. The impulse to use, to escape, to seek oblivion is not a flaw, it is a cry for something deeper. Beneath the self-destructive pattern lies a spiritual hunger, a longing for meaning, for connection, for an experience of inner unity. True healing, then, cannot rely solely on abstinence or behavior modification. It demands symbolic transformation. Jung believed that people become ill when they lose their symbolic center, the internal image or experience that gives life direction and coherence. Without this inner compass, the psyche fragments and the individual drifts, searching for substitutes in substances or compulsions. A symbol, when it emerges, offers a new axis. It is not an idea imposed from the outside, but a living image that rises from the depths of the soul when pain has been fully acknowledged and embraced. In ancient cultures, symbolic rituals were central to healing. They marked transitions, honored pain, and reconnected individuals with the sacred. Addiction, from this perspective, is not just a disorder, it is an initiation gone wrong. The addict seeks to cross a threshold, to be reborn into a different state of consciousness. But in the absence of a guiding myth, a ritual container, or inner grounding, this threshold becomes a trap. Healing begins when the symbolic is restored, when the addict finds a way to tell their story in a language the soul understands. This symbolic rebirth is not something others can give. Therapists, mentors, or spiritual guides can support the process, but they cannot do it for the person. The true transformation occurs in solitude, in silence, when the addict stops running from the wound and begins to listen to it. In this listening, the pain ceases to be meaningless. It becomes a message. The wound becomes a teacher. The brokenness becomes a doorway. The substance that once numbed begins to lose its appeal because the real meaning is finally being met from within. Addiction, in this final understanding, is not merely a mistake, it is a symbol. It represents a spiritual emergency, a soul-deep search for wholeness. When the individual discovers this, they no longer identify with their suffering, but with their capacity to transform it. They no longer seek escape, but presence. They no longer fear the darkness, because they have walked through it and found light. This is the promise of Jung's vision, not a return to who we were, but an arrival into who we truly are. The wound does not disappear, but it becomes sacred.